We can't take people places we haven't gone ourselves. So if we rescued or unburdened our own parts that we're disconnected with, it's really hard to know how to kind of help other folks do that themselves. Because I think there is a tendency to like want to rush and like hurry and rescue these exiles in people's systems before we've really assessed, is the system really ready to incorporate that?
In a world moving faster than our minds were designed to handle, mental health is becoming one of the defining challenges of our time. Welcome to Mental Health in a Modern World with holistic health practitioner Greg Schmaus. After overcoming severe anxiety and OCD in his own life, Greg dedicated the past decade to helping others heal through a fully integrated approach to mental health, combining lifestyle coaching, psycho-emotional healing, mindfulness, and archetypal work. Over the years, he's facilitated thousands of sessions, guiding people back to peace, clarity, and a deeper connection with themselves. Each week, Greg shares powerful solo insights, conversations with leading voices in holistic healing, and immersive live coaching sessions that take you inside the healing process itself. New episodes every Friday. Follow the show and start reclaiming sovereignty over your mind in a modern world. Here's Greg.
Chris, welcome to the podcast, man.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me, Greg. Good to see you again.
Yeah, you as well. So I'd love for you to share just with our listeners a little bit of your backgrounds, just so everyone can get a sense of who Chris is, where he comes from, and just some of the work that you do.
Kind of where to start. I've been a trauma therapist for 35 years. Started off not really knowing that was what I was going to be doing, but pretty soon into my work, I worked at a family service agency, and Marilyn Vandenberg came out about her story about sexual abuse, and they asked for volunteers to man the aftermath of that, and so began really listening to people's story about their trauma history, and when I first came out, trauma was not a main topic, and we weren't really looking at mental health being so connected to trauma. And pretty soon after that event, I began asking people more to share, like, as something, uncomfortable or that there any abuse happened to you. And I began getting stories of sexual abuse and trauma, and began specializing in how do we work with that? Like, what's happened to people? How have their essential qualities in their self gotten thwarted as a result of those traumatic events? And I began studying with a guy named David Kaloff, and he was an expert in multiplicity and trauma back in the day. And so I studied with David for about 10 years, and then ran across Dick Torts and IFS, and continued to learn about internal systems and multiplicity. Back when I started, we thought of the mind as being sort of a plural, singular entity, and that multiplicity was a result of traumatic events and coping. And we didn't sort of think of multiplicity as a natural way the brain operates. It's really wonderful to be part of a field that's evolved to really consider multiplicity of mind as being the way that we're really naturally organized. And it's so much more freer than having it being sort of a pathological phenomena.
Yeah. Can you give us a little, just for the listeners, a little extra background in terms of multiplicity? Like, when you talk about the multiplicity of the mind, what are you speaking to?
From IFS and lots of other modalities, even Freud and Jung, in some ways, thought of our basic nature of our psyche as being multidimensional, and that we have various parts of ourselves that operate in various ways. And there may be degrees of which we have co-consciousness and awareness, and some degrees in which we're not conscious of certain aspects of ourselves, and thus we have sort of the unconscious. But it's very natural to have more of a fractal-like system that operate and respond based on stressors, and then certain aspects of ourselves take on extra roles and extra functions. And then certain parts of ourselves get trapped or locked or frozen in time. And from traumatic events or overwhelming events, we have this phenomenon where we get lost in the past and sort of caught in a loop of replaying those traumatic events. But that's sort of the natural makeup of the psyche, not that we have sort of a unal, pluralistic, self. We have sort of multiple aspects of our entire system.
Yeah, and within IFS, one of the things that you teach is this idea of protectors. And so I'd love for you to share how during these traumatic events, how and why the psyche starts to recruit a protective system around the trauma, and how a lot of what we pathologize as mental illness is actually expressions of that protective system.
Yes. One of the ways I think about trauma is that we often have really difficult, overwhelming events happen in our life. And if we do have people that can help us process those events and talk through them or help us with how our body responses, every bad event doesn't turn into trauma. Often traumatic trauma, the way it forms maladaptively in our system is because we're often all alone or that we have the perception that we're alone. So we have to cope with an overwhelming, difficult situation. One of the ways that we cope with that is we have natural responses to that. We have a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So we have natural ways of reacting. Sometimes those responses get blocked and not completed. And so those blocked responses get locked in our system. We also tend to develop negative beliefs about ourselves and as a response to that. And those negative beliefs also get locked in our body. If we can't respond adaptively, then we have to form other ways of responding, or we have to lock that event away and somehow try to pretend like it didn't happen or it wasn't impactful or minimize it and develop other ways of coping, sort of moving forward. Often these protectors are sort of a never again response to these dramatic events. And then that never again response may have sort of various forms. It may have a reactive, I'm going to be reactive. That way no one ever can harm me this way again, or I'm going to be preemptive. I'm never going to be, put myself in a situation, or I'm never going to allow myself to trust someone like this again. So we have reactive or preemptive strategies to try to prevent those bad things from happening to us again.
And so, with that framework, which I absolutely love, would you say that most mental illness that we pathologize are really adaptive strategies of the psyche?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is adaptive strategies of the psyche. We all have certain sort of vulnerabilities and temperament and biological functions. There's different sort of combinations of things that makes us susceptible to our environment or different things that we may have to contend with. So I wouldn't say it's like everything. Like sometimes I have depression because my hemoglobin is high, and my vitamin D is low, and I have to sort of go and get my hemoglobin, lowered and make sure my vitamin D is in order. And I can be pretty depressed and lethargic. I may come out of being having the mild depression, but I've got something biologically happening to me. So I would say it's always that quite frequently what we deem as pathological or adaptive responses to a really thing we're seeing even now. It's even more prevalent about how difficult our environmental system is with oppression and systemic abuse and years of colonization that some people have had to go through that, so we're seeing really kind of how difficult of a world system we're having to live in. Being healthy in a messed up world isn't the most ideal, circumstances that we're having to.
Yeah. I remember, I don't know who said it, but there was this quote, it's no sign of health to be adapted to a sick world, something like that.
Yeah, I love that quote. And I think it's very accurate.
Yeah. I love that you also mentioned kind of like the bottom up approach, that a lot of symptoms in the psyche can be actually imbalances in the body. And so I'm curious, over, the 3+ decades that you've been in this field, have you seen shifts in terms of, you could say, more integration of body mind, more of like a holistic approach rather than kind of compartmentalizing?
I'd like to say I have. I think knowing you and knowing that, you work as a team with medical providers, and so that I think it takes a lot for therapists to have a team of folks that they can rely on and that can consult with. So I don't know. I think over time, like having, a really good psychiatrist, having a medical doctor, having women's health, specialists, having functional wellness people, even chiropractors, having that team of folks, body workers, so we can really address things homeopathically and expansively is really valuable. I think a lot of therapists are still kind of operating out of their office with, trying to do like a therapy to treat everything. So I really, if you can, to really get a very holistic and complete, diagnosis that includes, blood work and, all of those things. So
Yeah.
I think they're really important. I don't prescribe to a thing and like everything's a part, like sometimes you hear that in IFS, like you're depressed as a part, or if you're, if you have anxiety as a part, it's really important to really address the whole dimension. So I'm not an expert on the medical, and I'm not an expert on pharmacological, solution, but I have people that are really good at it that I can consult with or get consults with.
Yeah. I find it's so important to be open-minded, because there's also a saying, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah. And there's a lot about human beings I still don't know. So
Yeah.
for all
Yeah.
these years.
And humility is, one of the most important ingredients too.
Yeah. Absolutely.
One of the things I'd love to touch on, in IFS, you talk a lot about the importance of befriending parts, and that there are no bad parts, that they all have benevolent intentions. And, I remember going back, this is now like 15 plus years ago, where I had severe obsessive compulsive disorder. And I noticed that initially I was always trying to get rid of it. I was always trying to fix it. I was always trying to kind of get the symptoms to go away, and it would always make things worse. What you resist persists. And then all of a sudden, as I started practicing meditation and mindfulness, I started noticing that the more I welcomed it in, and the more I treated it almost like this, little child that was screaming out for my attention, or this protector that was, looking out for me, it was almost like I naturally started doing parts work without knowing what parts work was. And so when I came across IFS and you guys are talking about befriending parts and not making them the enemy, even parts that are, self-critical, judgmental, self-harm, and the importance of really seeing the benevolence behind all parts and how essential that is. I see in especially like the coaching and self-help world, especially with like critical parts and things like that. It's always like, get the critics out, replace it with positive thinking. And I just find that never works. So this approach that you have started to really offer, along with a lot of the other instructors, has been so refreshing and aligned for me. I'd love for you to expand on this idea of really befriending some of these parts, even ones that present themselves in more like negative or self-destructive ways.
Yeah. I think it's naturally challenging if you have a voice inside your head saying mean things to you. It's really hard to get curious and befriend that part. Like it's hard to make friends with the bully, so it's a challenge to do that. I think when we go deeper and sort of pull back the layers of those parts, we do find that they're just trying to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, survival really became scary and threatening. And I'm sure, Greg, your parts may have OCD, there's a survival mechanism to that. There's a dynamic, there's a fear that something bad was going to happen. And this was a means of trying to survive. So when we come into a relationship with the parts and getting to understand them and listen to them, that's often kind of what we hear is things like, never again do I want this to happen. I want this feeling to stop, or I'm terrified I'm going to get annihilated in some way. So often we have to kind of get quiet, or we have to have someone support us to kind of listen to those parts and kind of hear, like, what's the fear underneath that? And then hearing the fear underneath that, then we can begin to help them. And, a lot of the young parts and protectors tend to be fairly young aspects of ourselves and trying to cope with a kind of an overwhelming world. That relationship with the parts really opens up the relationship so they can begin to entertain the idea that they could do something different. If you're in a threatening situation, it's hard to even look around and determine, like, is there any other options here? So that gives them space to begin to, like, peek around the corner and see, like, well, is there any other options? I thought, like, just saying this really if I say this really bad thing to you, you do work hard, but you do practice, you do things that I'm afraid you won't do if I don't. So there's not space to even consider other options.
Yeah. It's like the critic kind of cracking the whip, and it's
Yeah,
afraid that if
oftentimes.
it doesn't do that, you won't keep running or.
Yeah. And fear is a good motivator. We do a lot of stuff we don't want to do because we're afraid of what will happen if we don't. So it does work, but then it kind of has its shelf life. It kind of runs out of energy. It runs out of fuel. We stop wanting to respond to that anymore. So there's got to be
Yeah.
another way it's more effective.
Yeah. One thing I'm really curious about, because I have found this in myself, I have found this with clients that I work with, where a lot of our protectors almost like take on the energy of our perpetrators. Why do you sense the psyche does that? A critic would be an example of that, but why do some protectors take on similar energetic patterns or relational patterns as the perpetrators that we experienced?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think several things happen. One is oftentimes when we're young, we're susceptible. So we absorb energy and we absorb that energy into our body and then we kind of hold it. There's also kind of a phenomena of wanting redemption. If you make me feel like I'm really horrible, then it almost feels like we get locked together in a way. And then I need redemption from you to find my worth again. So it gets this sort of redemptive dynamic. This is often where you find folks really locked into an abusive relationship, that the person made them feel horrible about themselves. And then also that person holds the key to unlock the redemptive quality. So we kind of get locked in those patterns a bit, those trauma patterns. The other piece is that because we're susceptible, oftentimes the person that has harmed us is really important. One of my internal critics is very similar to my football coach. And back in high school, it felt really important to me to be a starter and to be seen as an athlete. So that football coach had a lot of power over my sense of self as a man. And he could be supportive, so 75% harsh, so my part imported that way of driving my system to do that because he was a person of authority and power and back in that time seemed to be important to me. So people kind of hold power in ways that these parts will take on those qualities, and the fear of failure or fear of worthlessness or whatever becomes really large, huge.
Yeah. What was coming to mind when you were sharing is the last 2 years I've been studying family constellation work with this woman, Sarah Payton. And family constellation work, you talk a lot about unconscious contracts and loyalties.
Mm.
And so I'm curious if some of these parts carry some of these contracts and loyalties with our perpetrators.
Yeah, it kind of gets multi-layered, and because they're unconscious, we kind of don't know what we signed up for. We don't know what we agreed to or what we gave away. So I think it's really great to see how those bonds or how those overcoupling, how it gets formed and held in the system. I think those are really good kind of ways of exploring what got created in there with those times. If you don't kind of understand a part, looking at the context in which it formed kind of helps us really understand the part fully. So we're looking at the context in which that part formed that way of trying to protecting.
Mhm. Yeah. And in constellation work, which I'm very curious, which we can get to after this, about the sculpting in a lot of your trainings and if there's parallels to constellation work. But in constellation work with these unconscious contracts, a lot of times we end up replicating them, just changing the names and faces of the people involved, but they're the same contracts repeating over and over. So I'm curious, from an IFS lens, how would you explain the repetition of those contracts from a parts perspective?
Because the IFS is a systemic model, a big part of systems is tracking patterns. And so there's a patterning that happens that if we look at these patterns, my background's in family therapy, so I trained as a family therapist and trained folks as a family therapy. So a lot of times, some of the premises behind family therapy is that symptoms are held in the family, and they're held within family patterns. So the pattern of the scapegoat So the hero of the family gets a special reward. The middle child gets rewarded for their spontaneity or their authenticity, and then there's a kid that just doesn't get anything. And so that kid holds the anxiety or the difficulty or badness of the family. And so there's a patterning of interactions that reinforces that expression from that child. So in that ways, those patterns get replicated in the family. And so the same sort of thing happens internally for us. Certain parts don't have any other expression. So their expression is to like make us anxious, or their expression is to like say like horrible things, like you're an evil person, you know. So that's the only expression that gets sort of blocked with the system. So when we try patterns, we can see systemically how is that pattern expressed within the system, and how did that pattern get set up to be expressed.
Beautiful. I remember I was in a ceremony with some plant medicine, and this was when I had just started doing family constellation work. And I asked just the medicine spirits, why do we do constellation work? And the response I got was, we recreate our constellations consciously so we don't have to recreate them unconsciously.
Yeah.
And a lot of our parts, like you were saying, end up recreating a lot of these patterns.
Yeah. When we bring something to consciousness, we have a far greater chance of changing it, doing something different. That's great. It's a wonderful response too.
Yeah. When we were in Ireland and you were teaching, we did a sculpt. And I'd love for you to share what that is. And I'm really curious if there are parallels between the IFS sculpt that you did and the constellation work that people do.
I have to say, Greg, I don't know a lot about family constellations. I'm learning more about it. So I have some ideas about kind of what happens in family constellations, but I'm definitely not an expert on it. We haven't really been a receiver of it. So sculpting makes us say what sculpting is. So sculpting is basically taking the system and externalizing it. And when we externalize it, we invite in a group, and this is one really powerful in a group, you have different people in the group that can stand in or role play your parts for you. And so IFS sometimes can be challenging because we're looking at this invisible system, and we're also responding to like body sensations, feelings, emotions. Sometimes we have a visual, sometimes we don't have a visual, sometimes we just have a body sensation. So we can take those systemic things and kind of make them more external and invite people to role play holdings as a placeholder for those aspects of themselves. I've been teaching, so part of creating healing circles is teaching people the skill of sculpting, because what I found was even teaching level 1, level 2, when we went online, it's very hard to show sculpting online. We can do it with 1 or 2 parts, so it's very hard to do that. In the old day, when level 1s, we would do quite a lot of sculpting. And my sculpt was actually with Sir Dick Schwartz was supervising my first sculpt. And so people don't sort of have that skill. But as a group work, sculpting is very powerful, and it's a great support to kind of not have to hold every single thing inside my system. To kind of have someone role play or tease out, and then it becomes really clear. Like now I can see the dynamics between the parts. I can see how close it is in proximity to me, far away it is. I can also see what else is held in the system. Like for me, like I carried my coach Styles. It was my football coach's energy in my system vicariously. Like you say, he owned a parking lot in my head for years. So I didn't really know I was carrying him energetically in my system. So in a sculpt, we can find out like what else is being held here, proximity to you. So a couple of the rules around sculpting for me is like to really keep it reflective of the person's internal system. So not having extra information come in that isn't really kind of arising out of the person's system. My understanding a little bit of family constellations is that oftentimes information is sort of channeled in from the outside that may come from an expert person's an expert in family constellations. That information can be pretty accurate and be very helpful. Sometimes with folks in a group setting, we get projections, we get analytical parts, we get helper parts, we get a lot of other information may be coming from the system, but may not be coming from the system. But I think the history of gaming constellations is comes from Africa, from tribal system that had been doing it for thousands of years. So I think to a lot of really, really ways that that's practiced, it's really beneficial and helpful. The way I practice is kind of keeping it simple, just having it really come out of the person's system as accurate as possible, and then checking on accuracy.
Yeah, beautiful. And I've worked quite similar in the constellation. Like my teacher, when you have people repping, she really has you stick to your body sensations and not go into like left brain analysis.
And that's simple enough information that the person can incorporate it, and not like, for me, when I do the work, like I want to know what's mine and what someone else's. That's me walking around in the world anyway. It's like, what's mine and what's everybody else's.
And along those lines, one of the things that you do a lot of is training therapists and facilitators. And so I'd love for you to touch on the importance of therapists and facilitators, any type of practitioners when they're working with clients, or whether it's individually or in groups, the importance of operating from self, and how a lot of practitioners and therapists are often facilitating from their own parts, and how that can kind of create almost like disruptions in the field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't say enough about that. When we sign up to be helpers, we sort of sign up for this lifelong journey to kind of know ourselves and to try to get as clear about what's ours and what's not ours, and clear about what it means to be in that helping role. And when our own traumatic material crosses over, when it gets touched on, it crosses over, when, our parts that may be in some of these trauma patterns are playing out with our clients. So it's really essential that we do our own work and that we try to be as clear as possible. Not that and we're all fallible, we all have different aspects of ourselves, and I think too, like, why are we doing the work? Why are we signed up to be a healer? And are we really here being of service, or is there some other dynamic or process we're trying to work out? Getting clear about that is really important.
Yeah. One of my teachers, Caroline Mist, who does a lot of archetypal work, she always says all healers must first go through their own initiation. And if they haven't gone through their own initiation, there's a good chance that they're rescuers. And
Yeah.
I'm curious, because I've had to explore this in myself too over the years. How much do you find therapists, practitioners, sometimes working through their unconscious material through their clients? Like you'll have someone whose clients are coming with a lot of the same challenges that they have. So how much do sometimes practitioners work through their own unconscious material through the people that they're working with?
I don't want to sort of pathologize that, because sometimes
not saying it's a bad thing.
Yeah, no, I think it's a bad thing. I just, it's sort of being clear in the conversation we're having, because people can really kind of take that pathologically. And sometimes it's happening inadvertently, and that we shouldn't feel guilty about it. I actually often feel my system can also feel lighter and more at ease after people have unburdened and we sort of work through this material together. So we should be able to heal together in some ways. How much of that is getting really placed onto the other person and is something we have to really be mindful of. And also, we can't take people places we haven't gone ourselves. So if we start rescued or unburdened our own parts that we're disconnected with, it's really hard to know how to kind of help other folks do that themselves. I like Carolyn's statement, because I think there is a tendency to want to rush and hurry and unburden these exiles or rescue these exiles in people's systems before we've really assessed, is the system really ready to incorporate that? And they're not ready to incorporate that, then we can cause harm, because we're actually throwing people too deeply into their trauma too fast. And our urgency is to be good, or our urgency to be seen as a healer, or to replicate kind of what we see other trainer's doing doesn't really stay attuned to the client system. So it's really knowing what's motivating us. Where's the motivation coming from? Is it coming from our own need to feel worthwhile or valuable or important, or the offset or critical parts, or is it really staying in attuned to the client system and what their system is needing?
Yeah. There's something I want to follow up about that in a moment, but before I go there, I'd love your perspective on this. So I was working with a client the other day, and I noticed my mind, a part, was really preoccupied with something that had nothing to do with the session. So there was some distraction, like in my system. And I noticed the client that I was working with, when they were inside working with their own parts, they kept saying, "Oh, like they kept getting distracted internally."
Mm.
And I got really, really curious. When we're working with a client, how much is there a shared psychic field where what's happening in my psyche and my parts, how much of that is having an influence on their internal process with their parts? I'm really curious of your thoughts on that.
It is these synchronicities are very interesting. And I think it varies with different clients. Some clients, we just kind of hold the door and bear witness and help them when they get stuck. So some clients need very little actually input from us to be able to work. And then some clients need very, very accurate attunement. Like I remember a client that had a really severe trauma history, and she's like, "Okay, how are you feeling today?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I feel good." And she's like, "Are you stressed?" And I'm like, "I don't feel like I'm too stressed." And she's like, "Well, why is your eye twitching?" And I did have a little bit more stress than I was aware of, And she said, "Well, how about if we should reschedule?" And I'm like, "Okay, you're right. Like, I think I do need to come in here at a much lower level stress level for it to be safe for you to work." And began to really meditate and watch my stress level and take care of myself more when she came in, because she needed a lot more accuracy and a lot more clarity to do the deep work that she was doing. So the trust factor in the space that she needed to be held was more than some other people that we can just kind of hold the door over and open for and bear witness, and they seem to really be able to do a lot of the work, and we have one when they get stuck. So I think varies a little bit. The attunement with the clients is what is the client's need from us to be able to heal? And do we have an open door where they can tell us about that without fear of consequences? And then do we know our system well enough that we can clarify that? What was that twitching in my eye? Okay, there was more stress going on, and that in combination with coffee tends to cause my eyes to twitch. So if I meditate and lay off the caffeine, my system is a lot more relaxed and more spacious. So how well do I know myself around what is that symptom? And
Yeah.
what is the needs of the client?
When you were sharing that, the image I was having is like a field with holes in it. And I'm wondering if people that carry more of a trauma history almost have more of like a porous field with holes in it, where if someone has less of a burdened system, like there's almost more integrity in their field. So the therapist's energy, it penetrates less. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I'd be curious about that too. And I had a conversation with Bob Falconer, and Bob writes a lot about energies and other energies in the field. And my takeaway from that is my question, like, "Bob, how do I become less porous?" And Bob's sort of response to me was, I think the question is more, how do I clear my system easier and quicker? Some of that has to do with being an intuitive person. Some of it has to do with, I tend to be a somatic person. I feel somatic energy around me. I can sit in a restaurant, and if the couple next to me is fighting or having an argument, like that, the energy of that from that table is almost like it's in my field of energy. Somatically, I can feel that, and it's disruptive to me, almost like I have to like put on blinders. So I don't know if that's like me being porous or me being kind of a sensitive person that's more somatic. So the porousness is kind of a little bit of a vague kind of metaphor in some ways for me. I haven't kind of worked it out yet. I know that my trauma history, like I do tend to be sensitive to words, and I do seem sensitive to certain people's energetic expression, and other people, the energetic expression, I'm not so sensitive to. So based on my trauma history, there are certain people that my system kind of orients to as dangerous, and I'm more susceptible to them, where other people are not dangerous. I think that we have to kind of work with a little bit more like what's happening now somatically in my body and tracking that, and then what is needed. We go back to befriending. If I befriend whatever's happening in my system, then I can provide support to myself, and then I can stay more regulated and stay open. So how do I relate to if my client says a word that is jolting or harsh to my system? How do I come into relationship to my natural response to that and ease my system, or to not get locked into it or have a part to go?
Yeah, I love that. So I'd love to shift gears for a moment and go into your experience. I'm really curious about how your experience working with plant medicine and various psychedelic in ceremony and more of a ritualistic shamanic fashion. How has that shifted your perspective on your work, on healing, on therapy? I'd love to just hear a little bit about your perspective and experience with that.
That's something I've talked a lot about. I don't provide psychedelic therapies. I'm not a medicine carrier, and I don't serve medicine. IFS is over. So Michael Mithofer was in one of the first trainings that we did. And I've known Michael. Michael's, if people don't know, is the MAPS training was developed by Michael and his wife. And so I've been sort of around it for quite a long time. IFS is seen as a nice adjunct for people doing plant medicine. It's seen as a good in preparation for plant medicine. Is also can be really important as people integrate. So preparation, integration is a really important component to plant medicine. So with IFS becoming sort of an adjunct therapy to it, DictWorks just released a new book on IFS and psychedelics. So he's talking about it, writing about it more. So because of all of that, I feel like I needed to know something about it. And I tend to be, if I'm going to know something about it, I'm going to go experience it myself and find out from the inside out. So I've had my own journeys with it. What was your question, Chris?
Just how it has shaped or impacted your perspective on healing work, on therapy, on trauma work, and anywhere you want to go with it.
Some of the benefits for being able to be in a space of non-duality is tremendously helpful. And I was a meditator, and I did Vision Quest. And so I was able to work with duality, and work with duality is sort of part of my meditation practice, and recognize that when I was locked in polarizations and locked in duality, and sort of the path through that. But the medicine work really opened up an experience of non-duality, and somatically where I could really deeply experience it. So that sort of lives in my body. The non-duality lives in my body. So I feel like my system is more regulated, more buoyant, able to not get locked in polarizations as much. So it's kind of really helped with that. The other thing I've experienced sort of states of unconditional love. And I think one of the things, Greg, that people don't talk a lot about is the amount of purification I had to go through to be able to access that state. So there was a lot of really, really difficult things that I had to experience. And there was a lot of things I had to sort of purge and release from my system, and having some of our mutual friends hold that space for me while I work that out and release that. And I think that there's not enough talking about, there is a purification process that is a natural part of the plant medicine that people don't have to be scared of, but it's unpleasant. And yeah, and so being able to kind of have loving presence to kind of normalize that and to kind of help me release what I'm holding in my system. That may be vicarious trauma, maybe energy that I picked up from the outside world that was kind of locked in my system. Then it's helped me through that. I've been able to experience sort of the higher states of consciousness, and unconditional love is one of those states of consciousness that has kind of really shifted my system. So I think probably until I did certain places, I would say most love is conditional. And other than being a parent, then I don't think I really experienced unconditional love from, I think my dad tried to do that the best he can. I don't think my mom knew what it was. So that was really beneficial to kind of really have that experience from the universe. My wife said something. She said, well, I think you need to trust the universe about this. And I was like, my response was like, what do you mean? The universe doesn't give a shit about me. You know, like I'm just on this rock spinning in space. And like, if I like spin off and die, the universe isn't going to stop and say anything about it, you know? And so I didn't really feel like the universe really cared that much about me. But then once I implemented medicine, I completely changed. I felt like there was some divine loving presence that, you know, was present in multiple ways. So that was nice.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah, beautiful. And you also have a history of shamanic studies and working with indigenous people and native outside of psychedelic work. I'd love for you to share a little bit about that.
I think the animist cosmology that a lot of, I think, is naturally found in indigenous cultures made a lot more sense to me than the patriarchal systems that I grew up in. Being able to sort of be in community with people that hold an animist view, that the trees have a spirit, animals definitely have a spirit, even the soil and the biomes that you know, that there's a natural spirit in everything. Being able to be with people that hold that worldview and practice relationally to the world in that way was very important and kind of anecdotal to my own sort of historical background. So I tried to sort of find opportunities to be invited in to those communities and to experience that with them. So I did things that get included into communities where I could be with people that are practicing that type of a way of being, you know, with the world.
Yeah, beautiful. And it seems like one of the big aspects of having access to that world is healing through community and healing through tribe. And obviously with technology, there's this sense of we're all plugged in, but we're not really connected. We don't really have that deep sense of belonging. And you have started to run healing circles. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about not just those healing circles. I'd love to hear about that, but also like why healing in community is so essential and how it really differs as a form of medicine versus like one-on-one therapy.
Yeah. Francis Weller talks about sort of, I think, the 9 gates of grief. And one of the gates that he really talks about that really hit home for me is that we kind of come into the world with this anticipation or expectation that we're going to belong in community. And then there's a grief and loss around that. And I think I spent most of my life trying to form community and trying to find a way of being in community. And in the early days, I was with Robert Bly and James Hillman and the Independent Men's Movement. And I was a big part of the Denver Men's Council back in the day. And we had this really beautiful community of men trying to figure out what it meant to be a man of integrity and authenticity. And so a lot of my healing happened in those communities and feeling loved by elders in the community that really could see my worth and value and mirror that back to me. So that was really important in my early development. What I noticed is that most people don't have that. There's a real loss and breakdown. And then when we look at Western culture, it's highly individualistic. Even with my own connections and being part of the IFS community, most of my life was still pretty isolated, you know, that I didn't have a community of people that I connected with on a daily basis or I was growing professionally, spiritually with, you know, so I was always building it. But I think that speaks to how severe the decay of community belonging is in our culture, that I figured, like, if I'm constantly building this and everybody else must be constantly building it too, because, you know, some of my negative self-beliefs are, well, I must not be very good at it. But turns out I'm actually pretty good at it. And there's just a lot of tides that are against that. And there's a lot of deterioration that's against it. So I think we have this kind of romantic notion that somehow Indigenous people kind of have that community or have that, but a lot of those communities have been horribly abused and deteriorated from systemic oppression. And so that trauma has created a lot of difficulties in those communities too. So it's been systemically attacked, throughout the world for, I think there's an idea that we've had 5,000 years of dominator culture. So dominator culture deteriorates community. It's out for individualism and separatism. So was the idea of creating healing circles is I think people have to have an experience of intentional community before they can go out and try to replicate it. And a lot of my individual clients came to me wanting more community. And I would say, well, see if there's a church group that you can belong to. Or maybe people are playing pickleball and you could sort of join that, or a badminton. But they weren't intentional enough that people really felt seen and belonged in. So if we don't have an experience of that, it's hard to go out and replicate that. And so that's what healing circles came from, is we need to experience it so then we can begin to try to find a way of trying to replicate that more solidly in our life.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I was recently out in Mount Shasta about a month or two ago, and I was teaching with a buddy of mine who does a lot of men's work. We went to spend the day on this older gentleman. His name's Tim Corcoran, on his land. And he does a lot of rite of passage work. And he's been leading sweat lodges for 50 years. And he does a lot of vision quests. And so we went to his land and we spent a lot of time with him, and he talked, and like a real wise elder. And then he took us through a sweat. And it just really hit me of just like how the two things we're really missing, especially as men, is number one, wise elders, like true elders. And number two is organized initiation. I'm curious your perspective on the impact of not having elders. And it's almost like we've shunned the elders away into nursing homes. Like they're not valuable anymore. And then the impact of not really having true initiation to bring someone from boyhood into manhood. It's women, seems like they kind of have that built into their biology a little bit more. But I'm curious your perspective on the impact of that for men.
Yeah, I think so. The way I understand initiation, there's two important questions. The one important question is, who's your people? There's maybe three. It's who's your people? The other question is, what are your gifts? And then the third question is, how do you bring those gifts to your community? So a rites of passage is a passage from adolescence, which is a me focus, to moving into the them focus, to the community. So it's kind of interesting that we have a huge me culture, and people don't even really know that the focus needed to move from adolescence into adulthood. And then the elders even more, the community, like how do I serve the community? What are the community needs and how do I serve it? So we're moving towards this, not sort of in a codependent way, but actually that there's something greater than ourselves that needs our service and needs our gifts. So that question around who's my people, what are my gifts, how do I bring that to my community, that whole process has gotten missed in our culture. And so when we look at white supremacy culture and individual culture and dominator culture, it's a very me-oriented, individualistic approach. There's not that question, how do I serve? Without elders, we can have people that are in their 80s that are still locked into the me perspective. Just because you're an elder just because you're old doesn't mean you're an elder. A true elder is their idea of how am I serving my community, and what's my impacts, what's my deliverables to that. So if you don't sort of have people that mirror that and actually live it, then there's no examples of what we're supposed to mature into.
Beautiful. When you were sharing, it came to mind like the me turning into the we, and how like a rite of passage turns the ego upside down. So it kind of flips the M into a W.
Yeah. I mean, not to say that to me, having a lovable identity is developmentally essential. If we're always questioning our lovable identity, then walking around with an empty backpack, we're always trying to get that thing filled up with something of worth. So it's really important for young people to have a lovable identity and have that internalized so they can make that transition to the we. So it's not that there's healing around our unlovability that is essential to occur. We don't just sort of make that transition by not having a self. We have to have a solid self. We have to have a solid ego. We need to be able to make a living, to provide for ourselves. And then we begin to move into like, how do I release my grasp, my attachment to that, so I can move into like, what's my gifts and how do I sort of.
Yeah, that's why I love that second question, which are what are my gifts? Because that's your innate sense of value.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd love to close with this. The title of this show is Mental Health in a Modern World. And we're living in a very interesting world right now with social media, with AI, with all the stuff. And so with your, lifelong experience in this work and with mental health, what would your message be for people to really maintain or recover or optimize their mental health with just the state of things right now?
Yeah. There's a quote by Henry Moore, and Henry Moore, he does these really huge art pieces that are huge murals. And he said the secret to life must be something that you can give your whole life to every day of it. And needs to be something you can never accomplish. So those two things going together really resonates with me because we're trying to have a better world or a better system or my God, like let's stop electing perpetrators and pedophiles. And we might cut this out of our podcast, but we're not.
No, we're good.
They're good. But that's sort of a lifelong process of work. And it may be something we can never accomplish in this lifetime, but it doesn't mean that I can't keep trying to like work towards making the world a better place and doing that with humility and relationship to other people, relationship planet, trying to do it the best way possible. But the work when I think about it, is the work is for the next generation. A lot of indigenous cultures have an idea that what we do impacts about 7 generations before, 7 generations after. So the impact we have on my children, my grandchildren, that makes it, and that's sort of part of the elderhood is what I'm doing now. Hopefully will impact my grandchildren, my children's after that. And there's plenty of love for my children to kind of want to do that for them and do what I can to have a better world for them. Yeah. Hoping that humanity is going to evolve in our awareness. The verdict's out. Do what we can. We'll see what happens.
Beautiful. Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show today. If people want to learn more about your work or your offerings, where would you like to direct them?
Yeah, if they go to BraceCounseling.com and sign up on the mailing list, we'll get a mailing list of offerings. So I teach things like, a lot of times I'm teaching very traditional IFS, the Healing Circle stream, facilitating streams, very traditional IFS. I don't teach plant medicine. I know a lot about shamanic work, but that's not sort of the offerings that I have professionally. But you can find out, you can get information about what we're offering and see if there's something that's beneficial to you.
Sounds great. And thank you to all the listeners for joining us on this beautiful journey today. And Chris, thank you again for coming on the show.
Great. That's great.